And of course, we're back. We're chatting about churches going back to normalcy, considering that we were given indication that religious gatherings are now allowed, but limited to 50 people. That includes synagogues as well as churches. Religious gatherings of up to 50 people are now permitted for South Africa's churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples, as I mentioned. Under the previous lockdown regulations, religious places of worship were closed since late March. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, a lecturer at Wits School of Governance, joins us to chat further. Rekgotsofetse, thank you so much for joining me on Weekend Dawn. Really appreciate it. Now, my first question is, 50 people in a massive church, how is it going to be policed or even monitored?
So it's almost impossible to police or monitor such a situation. In fact, there's very little evidence to kind of showcase that opening up churches right now or any sort of faith-based institution is valid in any particular way. But it does pose the question of, if you do have to monitor this in any particular way, does this mean that if a church has 100 people in, that the police can come knocking on the doors of that faith-based institution and say, we're going to stop this service? Now, at the beginning of the lockdown a couple months ago, we did see that in various different countries that the police were actually doing that, right? The police were stopping sermons from going on. The question is, are South Africans willing to do that? What is the danger that it poses both to this police services as well as congregants? And what does it mean for that separation of church and state as well? If you have police officers coming in and interrupting with faith-based institutions' work.
So, in your opinion, do you think it was a little too early to allow for gatherings to happen?
So it's odd. So I wouldn't say that I'm qualified to say it's too early, right? It's more that the experts are saying that it's too early, right? That there's no rational reason for this, which is a question that we're now beginning to ask around the lockdown regulations. What is the rationality behind the regulations? What is the purpose behind certain restrictions on people's freedoms in particular ways, right? So if you are going to restrict a freedom, there must be some sort of evidence behind it. And unlike other reasons, such as the limiting of alcohol sales, the evidence around allowing faith-based institutions to carry on is limited at best. Right. And I think that becomes the core question. And I think once you pose it as, is it too early, it seems like there's an attack against faith-based institutions. I think the rationale should be more, what does the science say? What do the facts say? And how do you keep people safe at the end of the day? So even if you want to say that the only way we can solve COVID-19 is through divine intervention, and the question should be that whilst you're waiting for this divine intervention, how do you create some practical reasons of keeping people safe within your congregation to avoid the spread of COVID-19?
I like that you mentioned the practical reasons of keeping people safe. And now you're thinking about a congregation or people getting together in a confined space like a church, and you think about how you would work things like physical distancing, especially because people sit quite close to each other in churches. Is it actually something that can happen easily, or is it something that still faces a challenge?
So I think with the right sort of planning, you can do it well, right? So I'll use universities, for instance. So universities are now thinking about how do you create lectures in a manner that you still have people on campus. And you can have certain procedures such as if you have 50 people in your church, there have to be 2 seats in between individuals. You have to maintain social distancing. There are things that, and I don't want to strip churches of their agency of being able to control that, right? We shouldn't perpetuate the idea that a church it looks like a club in the middle of the night of everyone just standing next to each other completely packed. You could possibly engage in activities that ensure that there's some sort of social distancing, that there's responsible faith-based worshiping, right? The problem is how do you monitor that? How do you enforce that outside of trusting and hoping that churches do it on their own? So I do think churches are capable of doing it, right? So that shouldn't be the question of whether churches are capable of doing it. It's whether we should be allowing this to happen at this present moment in time, right, without the proper mechanisms to enforce it.
Do you think things like communions and baptisms, etc., will also be put on hold, considering that that's quite close in terms of physical touching and drinking from a cup, etc.?
So I do think, as many people have said, that a post-COVID-19 world is about how do you create a new normal. And I think we will learn as time goes on how faith-based institutions adapt to a new normal, right? The idea of if you do communion, how do you handle that communion? How do you handle the lines that are trying to get the communion? If you're doing prayers, how do you handle a situation where people aren't praying too close to each other, right? Again, everyone in the world is trying to relearn what a new normal society will look like, including churches. And I think different approaches will be created as time goes on to adequately account for the spread of COVID-19 and other potential viruses that could erupt in the near future. So I think there's a possibility for churches to adapt, whether it is baptism, whether it's prayers. I think there's ways and mechanisms that churches can adapt in the near future. The question, as I said again, is how do you enforce that now in such a time of uncertainty?
So what comes when you say a new normal? I mean, I know a lot of people during lockdown were attending church just like how we're speaking on Skype or using YouTube, etc. That's sort of the new normal that we have to embrace, right? But what about the churches that don't want to go that route? The ones that still rely on people giving donations to churches, etc., etc. Are those churches going to survive the new normal?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought up donations and offerings, right? So it seems that that is the key driving force here, that churches are essentially going bankrupt, for lack of a better phrase, right? With very, very low savings, their costs are usually supplemented by their offerings and donations one way or another, right? So it speaks to the core of what is the financial model of churches now, right? And for some churches, you can do EFTs. There's some churches that can do some sort of bank application or an EFT to get their offerings. But for the majority of churches and South African citizens, that's not the case. So I guess the new normal now is speaking broader questions around inequalities in the country. And when I say inequalities, I don't mean monetary inequalities, but access to technology, access to financial institutions in an electronic basis. If churches knew that they could get all their offerings online, we wouldn't be having this conversation, I don't believe, right? If churches knew that there was a sustainable way of getting some sort of income, churches wouldn't be having this discussion. However, the new normal is going to be forcing churches to ask the question once COVID-19 starts dying down of how do we not get stuck in that situation again? How do we adjust our particular processes to ensure that even in the context of a shutdown or a lockdown, we will still be able to get income into the church to maintain certain processes? I do know there's many religious institutions that are using technology to spread their word, using technology to preach their sermons, right? And I think that's only going to increase as time goes on. The new normal of COVID-19 is not necessarily to nudge people in a particular direction that's new. The new normal is going to push people, fundamentally change the way they think about how the institutions function. And I think that will be interesting to see in the future.
I think as much as it's also up to the churches, it's also up to the individual. And my next question, obviously, is what do I do? I'm watching you and I chat right now on television, and I'm thinking, do I go to church tomorrow? Or it's a Saturday morning, do I go to Shabbos? Yesterday, a lot of Muslim guys were probably asking themselves, do I go do prayers at a mosque or do I do my prayers at home? What does the individual do when it comes to a situation like this?
I mean, if I had to speak as an individual myself, I think if the conception of your faith-based institution is completely reliant on being inside of a building, there's a question there, right? There's a fundamental question around what is the notion of that faith-based institution. I think as individuals in South Africa, if they understand that a physical building does not determine the level of your faith, then I think you can start making the good decisions that protect both yourself and others. Because the difference here is that even though you can do all you can do for yourself, right? You can protect yourself in multiple different ways. You can also endanger the lives of other people by participating in these activities, whether you know it or not. And I think that's the question that you need to ask around, is my faith centered on a physical building? And what does my faith say about endangering the lives of others? And I think if you use that determination at an individual level, you'll be able to guide yourself to a conclusion that I think sits well with yourself.
So do you think it's a really good decision that some churches have chosen not to allow people to come back to church?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic decision. I think it is. And these are churches, there are some very rich churches that will survive this, right? And there's very poor churches that are still on principle deciding not to open up. And I think we should praise them in particular ways, pardon the pun, that they shouldn't be not acknowledged for their efforts, right? So I do think it is important to acknowledge that there are poor churches who are advocating to not go to church as well, right? So I do dislike the narrative that we can paint all churches with one broad brush. I think at the end of the day, it's understanding that a church is a business that pays people at the end of the month. And these churches, like any other small business in the country, are suffering. Right. But the question then becomes, why should they be treated differently from other small businesses? And if they are, how do you enforce regulations to ensure social distancing?
Talking about enforcing those regulations, is it a normal thing, or can it be the new normal for us to get tested for temperatures or go through some sort of sanitizing mechanism when we go to church? Is that really the reality that people need to start living with?
Yeah, I think it's the reality that we all need to start living in, right? The world is not, this is not something new for the world. It's just something new for certain aspects of the world, right? So when SARS came out in the early 2000s in East Asia, Southeast Asia, it fundamentally changed the way that they handle diseases in that country and how people prepare themselves and protect themselves, right? Where if you go to a train station, people are taking your temperature, that there's cameras that take people's temperature and monitor that, right? And we're entering that new world that other countries have been involved in for the past 20 years. So if that means that when you enter a church that everyone's temperature is taken, I think that will become a new normal. When you walk into church that you have to wear some sort of PPE gear, I think that will become the new normal. The big question is whether people can afford that at the beginning. I think in the long run, once companies start hitting some form of economies of scale, start improving their supply chains of these goods and start spreading out, increasing the supply, I think the cost will drop of these particular items, right? So I do think churches now, they should be a responsibility and maybe even legislated by government to say that if you are going to have a gathering of 50 plus people, these are the measures that need to be put in place, that you have to take people's temperature, that people have to wear some sort of PPE gear, that people have to adhere. But you don't want to create a policy where you are forced to enforce, right? That you are physically forced as a state to go around townships, go around suburbs, looking for people who are defying the law. You want to be able to create a law that incentivizes citizens to self-regulate themselves, right? That incentivizes people to enforce this law without having some big bad police officer looking over your shoulder. So I do think the new normal will indicate that we need to now start taking the temperature when you walk into churches, that you have to wear a mask, that you have to have hand sanitizer, whether it is inside the church or every single seat should have access to hand sanitizer. And I think these are the discussions that churches will be having going forward.
Rekgotsofetse Chikane, thank you for your time. He's a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, chatting to us about the reopening of South Africa's churches, mosques, synagogues and temples, as well as other places of worship under lockdown level 3.